The answer might surprise you. What do I mean by the best key count? And no, I'm not talking about my favorite, which would be 10, I guess. Let's take a look at this chart. This chart shows an approximation of each key count's difficulty when it comes to the required strain versus the required complexity. For instance, if slightly raising one of these values disproportionately raises the other one. Both of these values contribute to a key count's difficulty, and I feel like the balance of these two attributes makes for a balanced key count. We can take a look at the opposite end of the spectrum to rule out the key counts that have too much emphasis on just one of these attributes, and what we'll be left with is one that's best at balancing both. In one key, there are no patterns, besides jacks. In fact, the only way to introduce more difficulty into a map is by speeding up the nodes, or making said pattern go on for a while. There are some things mappers do with complex timing rhythms, patterns that are designed for alternating fingers, and maybe even long nodes. But almost no dexterity is required. If a player is fast and strong enough, they could simply hit everything with one finger. 4-key is not that far from this. Once you learn basic handstream reading, a little bit of technical patterns, and acquire some amount of long note skills, you can play nearly every map in the rank section. It all comes down to how fast you can play. And with halftime being in the game, this one mod drastically reduces the difficulty of every map, with the exception of 3. These 3 maps take the strain to 200%, and introduces a high level of complexity with their long note usage. It's one of the few times where 4-key feels harder than 7. Halftime barely lowers the difficulty here because the level of long note skills required is so high, and there's barely any breaks or chill sections to recompose yourself. So yeah, you can have highly technical patterns in 4-key, but doing so will more than likely jack up the strain as well. Next, on the opposite end of the spectrum, well, Osu Mania can only go up to 18, and playstyles where you're moving your hand positions to different areas feels a bit different from what I'm talking about here. So let's look at DP. This is a 3-star map. I'm going to be making a different video discussing star rating and PP, but for now, this is what we have to go off of. Even looking at these types of leaderboards, we can tell just how difficult these maps are when the average score is quite low. And of all of these scores, I doubt any of these players are performing like this because they ran out of stamina. Stamina can play a role in these higher key counts, especially if you're a newer player and not used to using all fingers, but that normally happens once you increase the complexity to higher levels. Going down to 10-key, where for every finger there exists one key, the only people used to finger dexterity like this are people who play instruments or heart surgeons, so the usage of pinkies and ring fingers adds difficulty here. A lot of the learning curve comes from getting used to using these fingers and alternating them in a precise way, without chord mashing. Getting up to the 4-star range, physicality and stamina does start to play a role, but when it comes to you improving scores, a lot of that comes from just learning how to hit the patterns correctly, and good technique that doesn't strain your hand so much. 6-star maps do get fast, but at this point, the dexterity required is so high before your stamina is the determining factor of whether or not you can play these. So now that we have a good idea of balancing strain and this thing, there's still one more attribute I want to bring up. Symmetry, or odd numberedness. It's kinda surprising how there's only 3 rankable odd number key counts in Mania, 5, 7, and 9. There's nothing inherently wrong with these, but it does bring up some concerns. If mappers create patterns like this, which are designed in a specific way in their head, there's no way of enforcing which thumb the player decides to use, and some could end up playing it like this, which would make it much more harder and may miss whatever emphasis the mapper is trying to create. Now obviously, 7-key players eventually get good at hitting patterns in either direction, but it still feels weird that there's not a specific designated way that the player can be directed towards playing. And this is how even numbered key counts are better. Each hand uses the exact same number of fingers, and patterns can directly correlate to how players will position their hands. Yes, anyone can play with any set of fingers, regardless of the key count's parity or amount, but these even ones are at least a little bit more intuitive, and can keep everything balanced between the hands. 5-key doesn't really have this issue as much, everything feels more or less like a unit, and 9-key tends to do burst patterns using the 4 outer keys, and there's a lot of bracket usage for most patterns. This leaves us with the final 2 key counts, 6 and 8. I'm honestly surprised that 6-key hasn't taken off more than it has, especially in the Eterna community. It doesn't use thumbs like 7-key, so it's more approachable to 4-key players, and there's a huge amount of solo packs uploaded to Eterna online, as well as the in-game support with note skins and other settings. It provides just enough dexterity for those looking for something a bit more than 4 keys, while also allowing for a high amount of difficulty to come from strain. There's just one aspect that separates 6-key from 8-key. brackets. This is the hardest pattern in the game, and 8 key is able to offer more of that. If we compare it to 7 key, 8 key has the potential of having a higher skill ceiling. They both use the same set of fingers, so the strain will remain about the same, while the complexity could increase due to the added lane. There's symmetry for mapping ideas to directly translate into how they're played, and it doesn't get too crazy with the finger usage, so no pinkies or key alternating required. One small issue. There's no maps. And no, I'm not talking about the 7+1 crap, get that out of here. There's about 4 or 5 true 8 key maps, and maybe a few 7+1s that feel comfortable enough to play. With the lack of maps like this, it kind of feels unfitting to call this one the best key count, but it is by this metric. I think a lot of players gravitate towards 7 key because it's the norm, or 4 key because it's simple. And those players who do want to venture out to higher keys, they probably just go all the way to 10 because why not? At that point, you might as well use all 10 fingers. But anyway, I'll try to share some of the 8 key maps that I've made, as well as maybe making more of them. So yeah, please enjoy game. We can take a look at the opposite end of the spectrum. Man, I need water.